and foremost a hiker. And because of the things that I've seen on Pikes Peak, I got interested in history. And so I am not neither a historian nor a presenter. So bear with me, and hopefully the pictures that I'll present will carry us through here. Let's see, I'll share my screen. All right. Okay, can you all see this title?
Yes, Eric.
All right. I would invite you to save your questions until the end of the presentation. If you would like to ask me about a particular picture that you are looking at, remember the number in the lower right-hand corner. That will help me get back to the picture that you're interested in. The first structure on the summit intended for human shelter was built by the United States Army Signal Corps in 1873. Stone from the summit was used for its construction. The government hoped that the elevation of Pikes Peak would aid in forecasting the weather. To improve the livability of this building, a lean-to was added to the east side in 1874, bringing the interior space to just under 600 square feet. The primary purpose of weather forecasting was impaired by poor understanding of meteorology at the time, combined with an unreliable telegraph communication with Colorado Springs. The signal corpsmen had not expected the arrival of tourists. Most tourists were unprepared for the conditions at high altitude. Taking pity on these travelers, the corpsmen provided food, water, and shelter. Accounts of the corpsmen's sympathy and generosity were recorded in the newspaper. By contrast, the corpsmen themselves wrote of their frustration and inconvenience in their diaries. Washington, D.C. finally recognized the inadequacy of the original building, and a new signal station was constructed in 1882, which more than doubled their living space. It is part of this east wall of this 1882 building that has been and will continue to be preserved as a testament to the endurance of those corpsmen who lived on the summit all year round. By 1888, the Signal Corps acknowledged the site's inadequacy as a weather station. This was the same year the wagon road from the town of Cascade was completed to the summit. By this time, it was clear that tourists were the true value of the summit of Pikes Peak. This stimulated a three-way competition between the Cog Railway, Frank Loud, Alfred Lewis for the control of the top of the mountain. Major John Hulbert advocated for the railroad that would transport tourists to the summit of Pikes Peak. On September 29, 1888, he formed the Manitou and Pikes Peak Railway, along with the presidents of three of the region's major railroads. The railroad men saw the venture as a way to increase ridership on their own rail lines. Zalman Simmons of Simmons Mattress fame provided most of the funding for the project. The railroad wanted control of the summit for their upper station. Frank Loud, Colorado College professor, renowned mathematician and astronomer, argued for the maintaining the Summit House for meteorological research. He suggested that this could be done without any government expense by leasing the facility to his Colorado Meteorological Association for $1 a year. He would fund the operation by providing food, drink, and shelter for tourists visiting the summit. In January of 1889, the military reservation, including the summit, was transferred from the War Department to the Department of Interior. Dr. Alfred G. Lewis, the future mayor of Manitou, recognized this as an opportunity to homestead the summit. He immediately filed a claim for 160 acres. He saw this as an opportunity to establish a tourist concession on the summit. The General Land Office in Pueblo had not heard of the land transfer and refused Dr. Lewis's application. He appealed to the General Land Office in Washington, D.C., and was turned down again. Undeterred, Dr. Lewis built a stone shelter on the summit to meet his homestead residency requirement. The Department of Interior, being concerned about the security of the signal station building, decided to hire a custodian. Dr. Lewis applied for the job and got it. He moved into the Summit House and began serving refreshments to the tourists. When the Secretary of Interior heard the occupancy requirement, he fired Lewis and hired somebody else. On September 25th of 1889, the Cog Railway began laying track in Engelman Canyon. 800 men and 100 mules completed the Cog line to the summit in just over a year. On March 10th of 1890, the Secretary of Interior granted the railroad an easement of 5.5 acres, including the Summit House, for their station. The Cog won the battle for control of the summit and delivered their first passengers on June 30th of 1891. In 1898, Zalman Simmons contracted with the Manitou entrepreneur Joseph G. Highstand to manage the Summit House. Highstand was to provide lodging and observation facilities for people visiting the summit. He provided heat for the rooms, Spartan furnishings consisting of an iron bed, a chair, a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and of course a thunder mug under the bed. In 1899, Highstand completed the single-story addition to the Summit House with an iron observation tower on its roof. By 1903, he had added a second story to his first addition, raising the observation tower even higher. Inside the Cog Summit House was a lunch counter and a Western Union office.
Eric,
Yes.
there's a funny ticking noise in the background. So I'm going to ask if anyone does not have themselves on mute, could you please mute? And I'm not sure if you got something in your office, Eric, that might be making that noise.
I'm not hearing it, so.
It's a clicking kind of noise. So anyway, it comes and goes, but please carry on. Sorry, Eric.
Are you hearing it now?
No, but it keeps coming in and out, so it could be just a Zoom issue, but I would just keep on going. Thank you.
Okay. Let's see. There was also a souvenir shop, accommodations for overnight guests, access to the observation tower was inside, allowing for the collection of a fee. The COG continued to add more space to their summit house through the 1930s and 40s. Early on, Spencer Penrose attempted to purchase the COG for his growing tourist empire. Zalman Simmons refused to sell. So Penrose acquired the rights to the 1888 wagon road and improved it for automobile traffic. The new highway opened for business on August 1st of 1916. He assembled a fleet of Pierce Arrow touring cars to transport his guests to the summit. Simmons built a fence around the COG house to prevent the auto tourists from accessing his view and his lunch counter. In 1917, Penrose built a highway summit house to provide for his highway guests. Around 1920, the highway summit house was nearly doubled in size to accommodate the increasing numbers of highway tourists. Penrose's success cut into the COG business. In 1925, Simmons agreed to sell to Penrose for $50,000. By the mid-1930s, the highway summit house had been abandoned and reverted to the Forest Service, which was a condition of the Penrose use permit. In 1936, the Pikes Peak National Forest Supervisor Everard Keithley proposed the building of a consolidated summit house to accommodate the highway customers and the guests of the COG. He thought he could use Works Progress Administration funds for construction. Keithley's proposal included a promenade around the edge of the summit, a COG station, a museum, a lounge, a terrace, a dining room, a kitchen, automobile parking, and a corral for burros. Fred Barr was still running his popular Summit Sunrise burro trips, an attraction that was continued by his successors until about 1960. The WPA turned down Keithley's application on a technicality. In 1938, Penrose hired the architect Charles E. Thomas to design a remodel for the old stone COG station. A second story would be added and the entire building reinforced with steel beams. The first floor would include 5 bedrooms, men's bunk room, indoor toilets, a woman's lounge, a lunchroom, and a telegraph office. The second floor would include observation room, a curio shop, and 5 more bedrooms and 3 bathrooms, a living room, a kitchen, and a pantry. This renovation was to be known as Little Broadmoor. The project was never built, perhaps because Penrose died the year later in 1939. On November 9th of 35, the Pike National Forest issued a special use permit to Orrie and Benjamin Stewart for the management of Glen Cove Inn and the Highway Summit House. In 1938, the Stewart brothers added a second story and a lookout tower to the Highway Summit House. And an L-shaped wing was added to the west side of the building, and a separate structure was added for restrooms. The renovation was performed by the Civilian Conservation Corps and cost the Stewart brothers $8,000. I'd like to point out a couple of things. Oh yeah, there's my mouse. Here you see a water tower that was serving the Summit House. This was the restroom that I mentioned as being a separate building, but it is connected to the Auto Summit House by this causeway. you see over here, just the corner of a building which I will talk about in just a few minutes. Let's see. Their renovation included a lunch counter, souvenir shop, and both an indoor and outdoor observation decks. The Highway Summit House remained in this configuration until it was destroyed by fire in August of 1953. The structure was fenced off for fear that it would collapse. When they attempted to knock it down with the bulldozer, they found it so well constructed that dynamite had to be used for its demolition. This 22 by 42 foot structure, right here, was used as a bunkhouse for employees of the Summit House and the highway. It was built around 1922. In 1965, it was purchased by the North Slope caretaker's wife and moved intact down the Pikes Peak Highway to a location on Highway 67, just south of the Mueller State Park entrance. It is still there and has been remodeled as a private residence. This aerial photograph of the summit shows the relationship of the buildings that I've been talking about. Starting up here in the upper right, that's the bunkhouse. Next to it is the Auto Summit House with the second story addition that the Stewart brothers made. This is the Cog Summit House. This is the Cog's water tower, which was fed by a pump down here that used to be near the second to the last switchback on the auto highway. After the Highway Summit House was destroyed, the city, the Forest Service, and the Broadmoor agreed that a new Summit House was needed to serve both auto and Cog tourists. However, it would take 10 years to find the funding, resolve the jurisdictional issues, and work through the design alternatives before construction of the current Summit House could begin. Completed in 1964, the present Summit House is a steel frame building with walls of precast concrete panels. The interior originally contained a lunch counter, a curio shop, offices for the Pikes Peak Highway Patrol, the Cog Dispatcher, and a historic display area, a photo shop, a boys' dormitory, sleeping rooms for 5 women employees, a dining room for the employees, and a kitchen and modern restrooms. The architect called for the removal of 12 feet of surface material and the whole backfilled with structural material to provide a stable foundation for the building. The bids for construction came in over budget. The architect revised the foundation design, resulting in a savings of $78,000. Construction began on May of 1963. The grand opening celebration was held on June 15th of 1964 with 300 people in attendance. In addition to the new Summit House, they were celebrating the inauguration of the new Swiss 80-passenger Cog trains. One of the new trains carrying dignitaries to the celebration overheated about 2 miles from the summit and was delayed until the problem could be resolved. By 1964, it was discovered the southwest corner of the new building had settled 6 inches due to the melting permafrost. Concrete was pumped under the building to attempt to fix the problem. However, it failed to do so. In 1965, tunnels were dug under the building to repair the broken sewer lines and to and sorry about that. And to place 12 jacks under the steel framework in an effort to keep the building from sinking further. The problem continued, and by 1995, 40 jacks had been placed under the building. Every year, an engineer surveys the building to determine how much to raise or lower the jacks to keep the building level. In 1963, the United States Army Research Institute of Environmental Medicine established their high-altitude research laboratory on the summit. It was originally housed in a trailer and a double-wide modular structure located where the new summit complex construction is now taking place. In 1969, a metal building for the high altitude research laboratory was located at the west end of the parking lot. In 1980, it was enlarged and now houses 2 laboratories, a medical aid facility, a dormitory, a kitchen, a laundry, and a bathroom with showers. Nearly every summer since 1963, the United States Army has brought a small group of soldiers to the summit to study the effects of altitude on human physiology. Research in this building led to the development of the drug Diamox for the treatment of altitude sickness. I'd like to point out another structure here in the upper right-hand corner. I will be talking about that soon, but this gives you an idea where it was in relation to the high altitude research laboratory. There used to be a concrete block building on the south side of the summit that bristled with radio and microwave antennas. It was built in 1970 to house a prototype sewage treatment plant. It was operated by the wastewater division of the Colorado Springs Utilities for 2 years, and then turned over to the Pikes Peak Highway. By 1974, the sewage treatment function had been moved to another structure. In the early 1980s, the building was taken over by Colorado Springs Utilities Water Division and used for communication of Pikes Peak watershed data. It was also used for communications by the Forest Service and other state and federal agencies. As a result, the building became known as the Radio Building. Little is known about the age or purpose of this wooden structure. It was located on the site of the new summit complex. It has all the earmarks of being a restroom and may have served that purpose for the old stone summit house. In February 1973, the City Council approved the construction of an auxiliary building that included an observation deck, loading dock for the COG, a gallery for historic photos, restrooms, and the sewage treatment plant. Encouraged by historic preservationists, the east wall of the COG Summit House was to be preserved. It was hoped that this artifact could be incorporated in the new auxiliary building. However, inclusion of the stone wall was cut from the budget, and only a short freestanding section of the 1882 building was preserved. The auxiliary building with its sewage treatment facility was completed in the spring of 1974 and was called the plant. By 1984, it was determined to be more economical to truck sewage off the summit, and the sewage treatment function was abandoned. This building was demolished in 2018 to clear the way for the new summit complex. In 1981, the Olympic the United States Olympic Committee built a monument to recognize Colorado Springs as the amateur sports capital of the United States. It consisted of a semicircular windscreen that sheltered a propane torch. Plaques with the names of all American gold medal winners were mounted on the screen. The torch was to be lit in perpetuity. Objections were raised concerning the energy wasted by the flame and a possible conflict of the peak's National Historic Landmark status. The monument was removed in 2002. It was felt that it would be seen by more people if it was located in the Olympic Training Center in town. This is the structure I pointed out in the photograph of the high altitude research laboratory. Another perpetual monument appeared on the summit around 1959 in the form of a F-94 Starfire jet. It was placed there by the Colorado chapter of the Air Force Association. In this case, perpetual meant about 5 years. The plane became an attractive nuisance and the city asked for it to be removed. An attempt was made to move it to the museum at Peterson Field. However, it fell off the truck on the way down the highway and was so badly damaged that it was buried near a gravel pit just west of Crow Gulch picnic ground. Concerned with the safety of the 1964 Summit House, City Council retained the architectural firm of Clifford Taylor to design a new facility. In 1997, Council reviewed the architect's proposal for a 35,000 square foot, $10.5 million structure. The project was sidetracked by the lack of funding and the Sierra Club lawsuit. The city used the funds to pave the highway instead. The history of the summit would not be complete sessionaires that attended the needs of the summit visitors. It begins with Thomas and Grace Wilson and their daughter Helen. The Wilsons ran the Pikes Peak Daily News, a publication containing information about standard local attractions. Their enterprise was located at Mountain View on the cog line, where the steam locomotives stopped for water. Mr. Wilson would board the train and collect the names and hometowns of the passengers. He would print an insert for the paper with their names and addresses. And when the train returned, young Helen Wilson would board with wildflowers, cookies, and newspapers for sale. As the train returned to Manitou, Helen would sell her wares. Helen's horse, Brownie, followed the train to Manitou so that Helen would have a way to get back home. We next find Helen Wilson as the first Western Union telegraph operator at the Cog Summit House. This was probably when Joseph Heistand ran the concession at the summit. Orrie Stewart worked for Heistand in Manitou, where he learned the curio and photography business. Orrie and his brother Benjamin started their own photography business in Manitou and later moved to Colorado Springs. When Heistand died in 1960, Orrie and Ben took over the concession at the Cog Summit House. Employment at the Summit House brought Orrie and Helen together. They fell in love and were married in 1919. The Stewart brothers continued the management of the Summit House under Penrose's ownership. When ownership of the Highway Summit House reverted to the Forest Service, the Stewart brothers were tapped to manage that facility as well. When the Stewarts expanded the Highway Summit House in 1938, they included a space for Thomas and Grace Wilson to publish their newspaper. After the deaths of Orrie and Ben, Helen, at this time Stewart, continued to run the concessions on the summit, while Ben's descendants ran the photo business in Colorado Springs. Barbara, Helen and Orrie's daughter, married tour car driver Bill Carl. Helen hired Bill as assistant manager of the COG Summit House. When the new 1964 Summit House was built, Bill Carl became its manager. Bill carried on Helen's role as Pikes Peak ambassador, greeting visitors and caring for their countless needs over the years. Bill remembered visitors' names and hometowns from one season to the next, and he could greet returning guests by name. The lunch counter was the physical evidence of the family's commitment to the enjoyment of their guests. Bill and his staff, standing behind the counter, served their visitors coffee and donuts and answered their myriad questions. Grace Wilson, Helen's mother, developed a recipe for the donuts that became the must-have treat of any visitor to the summit. Bill Carl Sr. was known to personally supervise the preparation of the dough for this unique delicacy. He would reprimand the cook for putting too much or too little sugar, or for stirring the batter too much. Bill's son, Bill Carl Jr., remembers listening for the horn of the approaching COG train before dropping the donuts into the boiling fat, so they would be fresh and hot for the new arrivals. Bill Sr. continued his personalized service until 1992, when the city awarded the concession contract to Aramark. The personal service disappeared, and now the visitor's first contact with staff is at the cash register. The summit visitors' experience is about to change with the construction of the new summit complex and the completion of the renovation of the COG Railway. The new 38,000 square foot building will be more than 3 times the size of the current Summit House. Inside will be a kitchen, dining room, gift shop, restrooms, and an interactive exhibit of history of Pikes Peak. Outside, there will be observation decks, seating from which to enjoy the views. Walkways will lead from the building to points of interest and the views around the summit. No other mountain in Colorado has attracted so much development, nor as many visitors as Pikes Peak, America's mountain. I'd be happy to entertain questions. Anybody has any?
I think if anyone has a question, I just ask that you unmute and ask the question. But Eric, I've got one I've got 2 questions actually I'm going to open up with. You shared an image of, I assume, an original donut. Where was that located?
Actually, that is nothing like the original donut.
Oh, okay.
If you all remember the Carl's concession, the donuts were kind of scrawny looking. They were really kind of strange. That donut is in the possession of Barbara Carl Day, who is Bill Carl's daughter, and it was given to her as a memento of the 5 generations of Wilson, Stewart, Carl families concession. I don't know where it came from, okay. But it's been shellacked and is much plumper than the donuts that were actually served on the peak.
Okay. Your question 2 was early on. you shared some images of, I guess, the original weather station. And I think you said people lived up there year round.
Yeah,
How on earth did they stay warm and get water?
that's an excellent question. Um, the military reservation that included the summit weather station was actually 7,200 acres and extended down the south side of Pikes Peak, far enough to go below timberline. Many of you will recognize the name of Paulsgrove, who had a halfway house on the Cog Railway. Well, the Paulsgrove family had a contract to harvest and deliver wood to the summit for heating and cooking. And Neil, your question is quite appropriate, meaning since there are no trees growing on the summit, and that would have been difficult to have any wood. Water actually came from 3 springs that were in the rock pile or near the summit of Pikes Peak, probably fed by melting permafrost. And in the early days, I'm sure it had to be carried by hand up to the early signal station. Later, when the COG had their station up there, it was pumped up from the second to the last switchback on the highway to that water tank that we saw in the pictures. That water tank was not used to water the trains, incidentally. They got their water from further down the track. Any other questions?
Yeah, Eric, we have a comment in our chat room from a Henry Bremers, and Henry says that my great-grandfather, Angus Gillis, built the original station atop Pikes Peak. Henry, are you still with us there?
Can you unmute him?
Yeah, Henry, are you still with us? Maybe you can contribute more information about your grandfather.
Yeah, I'm still here. Just took me a
Okay,
while to unmute.
Thank you for joining us, Henry. Do you have any other information on your great-grandfather?
Well, they built the Briarhurst and the Miramont Castle. There's all kinds of stories from them back then. Like when the priest got run out of the Miramont Castle, the guy that built it. So that's kind of an entertaining story, but you can read a lot about Angus Gillis and his brother Archie about their history in the Miramont Castle Museum. They've got, you know, pictures of them and some of the stories. My grandmother lived there with the Gillis family. Archie and Angus, they built a duplex. I believe it was on Ruxton Avenue. Still there. I visited it not too long ago, 10 years ago or something. And anyway, they lived in that building together, and my grandmother lived there with them. So my grandmother used to, when we were little kids, I'm 70 years old now, but when we were little kids, my grandmother used to take us to Manitou Springs to watch the Indians performing down in the little pavilion on the bottom and to ride the Cog Railroad up to the top and all that kind of good stuff. So it's, I got a lot of family history in that area. Have a lot of relatives buried there. Most of them have moved away, so I don't have too many relatives there anymore, but when I was a kid, I used to have a lot of relatives there.
Henry, this is Eric. If you're willing, I'd love to talk to you.
Sure.
If you wouldn't mind giving Mike your email address or phone number, whatever you prefer, I would love to get in touch with you.
No problem. I can leave you an email, phone number, whatever you'd like.
Great. I appreciate it.
My grandmother, talked with some of the local historians, and you'll find her in some of the literature. You know, she
What was
passed
her
away a
name?
long time ago. Even my mom passed away. So all of the people, you know, that used to live there are gone. But I still have a lot of memories of, you know, of Colorado Springs and Manitou Springs.
Great.
All right. Well, let's see. Are there any other questions for Eric?
I might mention that down on the main street down there, the offices of Angus Gillis, who, you know, was basically an architect, and his brother Archie, the stonemason, those offices are still there. So
Okay.
there's a lot of stuff from their time, you know, still standing. I'm not sure what they left up at the summit. I think there was a little bit of the original station up there that they built, but I guess the new building is, they're going to remove all that. So that'll be the last trace of anything they did up there.
Henry, did your relatives, your ancestors, build the 1873 station or the 1882 station?
That I couldn't answer, but I'm sure you could find the answer over at the museum, the Fairmont Castle Museum. I wasn't around in the 1880s.
Neither was I, and I'm a little older than you are.
Yeah.
There's a section of the wall of the 1882 station that is being preserved.
Yeah, I think that's the one that they did, but I, you know, like I say, I wasn't around then.
Well, that's great. And it is. I've been up since the construction was started, and they have protected it with basically just build a little wooden building around it to protect it. You may have noticed in my slides that the sign in that section of wall dates it as 1873. That's not true. It was actually a part of the 1882 building.
Yeah. I mean, it was a long time ago. I have a lot of relatives from there. The McMahons from there. My grandmother, she was a Gillis, but she married a McMahon. And they had a bottling plant to bottle the soda water way back before we had Coca-Cola and Pepsi and stuff. They were using the Manitou spring water to, you know, and bottling it and selling it. They did a lot of other stuff around there. My grandfather, Louis McMahon, he was the comptroller of the Denver Post for many, many years. Worked with the bond fees and all those folks. So when I was a kid, they were all really old people. My grandfather died when I was 5 years old, but I did get to meet a lot of those old people. And they were friends with Buffalo Bill, among other things. I used to have a picture of my mom sitting on Buffalo Bill's lap. She was probably about 5, just a little thing. But my family's been around in the area for a long time.
Henry, do you know whether Mr. McMahon was the owner of the Pikes Peak Bottling Company, which is a predecessor of the Ute Chief?
I think so. I know that they were in the soda bottling business for a number of years. And that's something else you can read about it at the Miramont Museum. I'm going to send you on the chat. I'm going to send you my phone number and my email address
Okay.
so you can get a hold of me for further discussion if you want.
All right. Also, I'd like to remind everyone that the Manitou Springs Heritage Center does have an exhibit about the mineral waters of Manitou Springs. We call our exhibit Bottles and Bottling Plants. And it's an exhibit that covers both the Ute Chief Bottling Company as well as the Manitou Springs Mineral Water Company, which were the two prevalent bottling companies in Manitou Springs. So, you know, at one time, hundreds of thousands of bottles of mineral water were produced in Manitou and shipped worldwide. But yeah, we'd like to find out more about Mr. McMahon. I do believe, though, I have some recollection that he might have been part of that Pikes Peak Bottling Company.
I think he was, but, you know, it's been a long time since I've even looked at that history.
Yeah. Our exhibits also include bottles, historic bottles from both bottling plants, as well as a detailed historical description of both bottling plants. And also don't forget the world famous Ute Chief Gusher bottle, which is the world's largest mineral water bottle you know, it's roughly 7 feet high, but you're all invited to come to the Manitou Springs Heritage Center to view our exhibit about mineral water.
Hey, Mike, I think there's another question from, is this Haney? Did you
Yes.
have a question?
Oh, hi. Hi, Eric. Betty Haney. John's here is here too, but I had the question. I think you've kind of answered exactly where the remnant of the 1882 Summit House wall is relative to the new Summit House. Or maybe you want to add just a little bit on that. But my question had to do with, is there any remaining weather station function, meteorology function in the new Summit House? Or when did the last, that seems like it would be a great place for a weather station through all the years. When did that end, if it did end?
You know, it turned out not to be a great place. Pikes Peak generates its own weather. And I think the government decided, very soon, you know, before the 1888 closure of the station up there, that this was not a viable place. As far as I know, there is no weather function planned for the new Summit complex. Anybody else have any input for that? In answer to your question, where the remaining section of wall is located, if you remember the position of the observation deck in relation to the current Summit House, that wall is between those two buildings, and probably it was actually closer to the observation deck and below the deck. It was fairly close to the cog tracks.
Mm-hmm.
And will remain there. I don't think they're planning to move it.
Okay, thank you.
Eric, we have another question from Rocky. And Rocky's asking whether this will be your next book.
Actually, there's a question from Joey Moon also that fits right in with that question.
Okay.
And yes, as a bit of shameless advertising, I'm working on my next book, which I hope to be out by spring of 21, that will include the history of the highway and the summit. What you saw today is a very small part of the story of the summit of Pikes Peak. And Joey's question was, what did the highway look like? And I assume that what you meant by that, Joey, was, did it follow the same route as the carriage road? And to a large extent, yes. If you've been up the highway this year, you may have noticed that the Crystal Reservoir was drained. The original carriage road and the highway both crossed Crystal Creek because there was no reservoir. And the original highway was only 16 miles long as opposed to 19, which it is today. With the draining of the reservoir, the original causeway and bridge over Crystal Creek was visible for the first time. And I was fortunate enough to get down there and take some pictures of it. When they built the Crystal Reservoir in the mid-30s, they had to reroute the highway over the dam, and that added some mileage. The other major deviation was at the summit, and I didn't point it out, but my summit, well, you know, it's in the book. The summit, I have a summit picture that shows the wagon road, which is still very visible in the rock pile at the summit of Pikes Peak. There were some other extensions and switchbacks to the carriage road to ameliorate the steep grades that the wagons used to climb. But basically, the highway follows the route of the carriage road, which to me is an amazing testament to the ability of those early engineers to lay out the road, especially the W's. Now, I'm amazed at the ability in 1888 with horses, mules, and hand labor that they could have built that section of road.
Well, in connection with your books too, we like to remind everyone that Eric's books can be found on the Manitou Springs Heritage Center's website at manitou-springs-heritagecenter.org, and you can see that we offer 2 books that were authored by Mr. Swab, including Fred Barr, the Pikes Peak entrepreneur, and also From Utility to Attraction, A History of the Mount Manitou Incline. So we invite everyone to visit our website to look at those books. They're both interesting reads and contain a lot of history about those two structures on Pikes Peak. Are there any other questions for Eric this morning?
Not really a question, but hats off to both Eric and Michael. My name is David Hart. I'm a transplant actually from the East Coast, but I'm a retired Colorado Mounted Ranger. One of the oldest law enforcement agencies in the state. I don't know if you all are familiar or not, but my company is actually one of the current subcontractors providing material up there on the peak. And Eric, I've got to tell you, excuse me, just doing some of the research since I've been up there over the last 3 or 4 months, your presentation today was just outstanding. Got to tell you, I've got a file that I'm building for the pictures of what's going on up there right now, and I think I've got more pictures of that 1882 wall ruins that is actually still up there. And I don't think they don't have any plans of moving that or tearing it down. But I think I have more pictures of that than pictures of the new building.
Well, thank you. Are you saying that you're now in the trucking business?
No, sir. I work for a company based out of St. Louis, Missouri, that is providing the shutters over the windows up there on the new.
Ah, okay.
And the Harrow Lab as well.
Are all the windows going to be shuttered?
All the windows except for the south facing, the very large elevation that kind of points south.
Okay.
They'll all be shuttered with automatic shutters that will come down in case of high wind or storm.
Interesting. Yeah.
All right.
But thank you very much, you all. This has been really, really good presentation and talk this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Eric. And we also like to thank everyone who attended this morning's presentation. Do we have any other questions or comments for Eric at this point?
Well, Mr. Schwab, this is Jeff Hovermail.
Yes, Jeff.
Well done, sir.
Thank you.
And I was pleased with this heritage series that it invited more individuals to learn more of the history. And you did very well in keeping this presentation into scope. As you said, there are many, many layers to the summit of Pikes Peak and the history up there. And so your focus on the built environment was very well done to weave that into the overall fabric. And I think we all learned a few new things. As many of you may know, I'm with the United States Forest Service, and for 25 years plus, I administer and manage the mountain of Pikes Peak, among anything, and oversaw the environmental assessment work. But I didn't know about this 1936 era little Broadmoor concept. And you let the secret out, Eric. I didn't know that a lot of folks knew that the bunkhouse was relocated and reconstructed south of Divide. Just a few folks in my mind were aware of that. And you're correct, it's still visible today, just south of Mueller State Park. So that's a good uncover. And I think overall, I just appreciate your continued efforts to add to the additional richness of Pikes Peak, whether it's the incline, your research with Fred Barr, the Fremont Experimental Station, and then the element of the structural world. So we appreciate your offering this to the public and the support of the Manitou Springs Heritage Program. So good work. Thank you.
Jeff, I hope you realize that you were instrumental in getting, in enhancing my interest in the history of the peak. And I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, and I wish I had more time on my dance card to contribute to these efforts. But I'm always limited, and I'm always rediscovering more of our archival information with the Pikes Peak Ranger District. So there's always more to come, and so we continue to build. I have my stories as well. I certainly contributed to the decision to have the Olympic Memorial removed back in the early 2000s. I'm currently overseeing the entire Pikes Peak Summit Complex project. The communication building, which was the original sewage treatment pilot project, that's removed. Late last week, G.E. Johnson completed the decommissioning of the old High Altitude Army Research Laboratory, so that's been removed. And of course, the plant building has since been removed. And so this is a great opportunity for our community to continue to work toward restoring the integrity of the summit of Pikes Peak as a National Historic Landmark. But at the same time, as you note, Eric, through the interpretive elements for the new summit complex, we will be able to preserve the history for the most part of the built environment. And there'll also be interactive touchscreen interpretive exhibits that visitors can learn more about. And even there may be an opportunity to link this presentation in some form to Pikes Peak America's Mountain website, or through some of the interactive interpretive elements up on Pikes Peak, because we can modify those at any time. I'm getting long-winded, but I really appreciate you giving a taste to everyone that participated today on the history of the built environment. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Jeff. We appreciate that. And we also have another presentation relating to Pikes Peak coming up on December 5th at 10 o'clock. That'll be a presentation to commemorate the 200th anniversary of Edwin James' ascent of Pikes Peak. And that presentation will be delivered by Mark James, who is a direct descendant of Edwin James. And Mr. James will be presenting a photographic exhibit and talk about the stops along the way as Edwin James ascended Pikes Peak. Do we have any other questions? Eric, we got a lot of comments here and thank yous, a great presentation. And thank you for all your research and everything you do in preserving the history of Manitou Springs. And if there's no other questions, that would conclude today's presentation. Again, thank you, Eric, for all your efforts in presenting the history of Pikes Peak and the structures on top of America's mountain.
You're welcome. Thanks for the opportunity.
All right.